Hey guys, tonight we slip beneath the covers of history, literally, and peek into how sex was a completely different experience, depending on how many coins jingled in your pocket. Picture this: silk sheets, citrus-scented oil, the flicker of bronze oil lamps dancing across marble pillars. Now picture this: a barn straw poking your back, and a goat that will not stop staring. Welcome to the ancient world where even in the bedroom class was everything. You probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me your location and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie on a carved Roman bed. It's wood imported from North Africa, polished to a soft gleam. Cushions stuffed with goose down, linen soaked in lavender. If you're upper class in ancient Rome, sex isn't just physical, it's a performance. Your lover might be a spouse, sure, but just as often it's a slave, a courtesan, or a conveniently available flute girl from last night's banquet. Your only limit: social rules, and even those are more like suggestions if you're rich. Meanwhile, if you're a common Roman laborer, you're just hoping the back room in your insula doesn't collapse mid-thrust. Privacy. Dream on. That thin wall's doing nothing against your neighbor's snoring, and your bed is more like a woven mat with questionable stains. If you want intimacy, you're better off sneaking to a stable or the riverbank and praying the night watchman's too drunk to notice. And you think modern roommates are awkward. The class divide even affected the senses. Rich couples had access to perfumes, incense, and aphrodisiac foods. A popular upper-class treat, dormice dipped in honey, paired with wine infused with exotic spices, because apparently nothing says seduction like rodent tapas. Poorer couples, however, made do with body odor, stale bread breath, and the vague hope that nobody had lice. Historians still argue whether Roman elites felt genuine intimacy in their relationships, or if sex was just another display of dominant status expressed through conquest, not connection. The historical record is full of poetry, statues, and murals that glorify desire, but also law codes and letters that treat sex like a transaction. And then there's the matter of architecture. Wealthy Roman homes had designated pleasure rooms, yes plural, complete with padded benches and suggestive murals. Some even had rotating beds. You, the rich Roman, might sip wine while reclining and watching two performers reenact a mythic seduction involving Zeus and a goose. Don't ask. It gets weird. But if you're poor, your pleasure palace might be the cramped alley behind the communal latrines. A stone for a pillow. If you're lucky, you find a brothel, but even those came with a hierarchy. Upper floor rooms were for the poorest clients. No window, no light, just a straw mattress, and 2 minutes of fumbling before the next guy knocks. One quirky tidbit: phallic charms were everywhere. Amulets, frescoes, wind chimes meant to ward off evil. The rich wore gold ones on chains. The poor maybe clay, or just scratched one onto a doorway for luck. That's right. Even superstitious penis art had a wealth gap. And let's not forget how sex shaped public identity. A wealthy Roman could boast of his lovers, men or women, and be admired. A poor man caught in the same behavior might be beaten, jailed, or enslaved. Laws didn't apply evenly. They were like toga sizes, tailored for the elite, too tight for everyone else. Still, in the soft candlelight or under the stars, even the poorest could chase fleeting moments of pleasure. A warm breath, a whispered laugh, a heartbeat that echoes yours. The hay might itch and your back might ache, but for a few minutes, even without silk sheets, you felt rich. Then the goat bleats again, moods ruined. You wake up before dawn, the flickering remnants of a torch casting shadows across the chamber. If you're rich, you're not alone. There's probably someone beside you, maybe someone your family approved of, or maybe someone you definitely weren't supposed to invite to your bed. But here's the thing: when you're upper class, you get away with things, especially in bed. Marriage, particularly in the ancient world, had very little to do with love and everything to do with status. If you're a noble Roman or Greek woman, your wedding night isn't a fairy tale, it's a transaction. You're likely 14, and your new husband is, let's say, not 14. You've been bartered off like fine wine, and the hope is that you'll produce heirs, not orgasms. Meanwhile, poor folks weren't exactly throwing rose petals either. Marriage ceremonies were short, sweet, and usually followed by a hasty coupling in a room shared with multiple family members. No privacy, no fanfare, and if you were lucky, a door that actually latched. But at least the expectations were simpler. Have kids, work hard. Maybe don't die of plague. In elite circles, virginity was everything, for the woman, that is. Men could pretty much do what they wanted. If you're a rich guy, your parents might have even hired an older courtesan to educate you before marriage. And the idea, get it all out of your system before you have to settle down with someone respectable. It was basically sanctioned premarital debauchery disguised as a rite of passage. Historians still argue whether these early sexual encounters were considered part of maturity or simply indulgent loopholes in social codes. What's certain is that the gender double standard was so baked in, it probably had its own reserved seat at the Senate. And here's the twist. For many rich couples, the wedding night wasn't the beginning of sex. It was the end of mystery. Once you were married, passion often dwindled into duty. Affairs became common, especially if you were a bored aristocrat with too much wine and not enough attention. Mistresses' boy toys, slave lovers, all available, often encouraged, and entirely behind a thick veil of decorum. For the lower classes, though, there was often more affection, believe it or not. Without the pressure of politics or property, many poor couples built relationships slowly with mutual consent and shared work. It wasn't always romantic, but it was often more real. One particularly bizarre ritual. In some Roman rural communities, there were traditions where villagers would sing obscene songs outside the newlyweds' home to encourage fertility. It's hard to feel sexy when your neighbors are chanting "Make a baby" in crude Latin 5 feet from your window. But hey, nothing sets the mood like folk pressure. The bedroom furniture told stories too. If you're wealthy, your bed frame is carved with cupids and laurel leaves, and the linens come from dyed Egyptian flax. If you're poor, it's a pallet on the floor, or worse, a shared family bed. Yes, shared. Many families slept all together in one room, sometimes one bed. You do not want to make eye contact with your grandmother mid-coitus. The pressure to produce children also hit rich women hard. If you're a noblewoman and haven't given birth within a year, the whispers start. Is she barren? Is it a curse? Should we sacrifice another goat? Meanwhile, rich men just shrug, pour more wine, and find someone else to try with. Poor couples also faced expectations, but theirs were more about survival. More kids meant more hands in the field. More mouths to feed, sure, but also more people to keep you alive when you're 60 and your knees no longer work. Sex wasn't always about pleasure. Often it was a duty, a strategy, a survival tool. But once in a while, maybe after a few sips of warm wine, or during a stolen hour at sunset, it became more. A laugh, a touch, a whispered secret that no one else would ever know, except the goat, who is somehow still there. Steam rises as you lower yourself into the tepid waters of a Roman bathhouse. The air is thick with sweat, lavender oil, and gossip. If you're wealthy, this isn't just where you clean yourself. This is where business, politics, and sex all swirl together in one marble-tiled stew. Nudity is normal, so is flirtation. And if you're rich, you have options. The bathhouse doubles as a social network. You're chatting with a senator while eyeing his young companion, who is probably not his wife. Courtesans wander in, draped in barely there silks. Slaves scurry about, refilling scented oils and fetching towels. If you want to hook up discreetly, there are alcoves for that private rooms, tucked just off the main pools, designed for anything but relaxation. Meanwhile, if you're poor, you might still make it to the bathhouse, but not every day. The entry fee's cheap, but it still cuts into your bread money. You can't afford perfumed oils, so maybe you scrub with sand or cheap lye soap. and hope it masks the fish guts from your shift at the docks. And those curtained alcoves. Forget it. You bathe, you leave. Flirt too long, and someone might mistake you for a working girl or boy. One mainstream fact: Roman and Greek bathhouses were not just tolerated, they were celebrated. Emperors built them as gifts to the people, complete with libraries, gardens, even snack bars. But despite this apparent equality, the sexual politics inside were anything but balanced. Sex work thrived in these places, especially for the rich. If you're a noble, you might hire a favorite performer from the latest festival and meet here for a steamy rendezvous, pun very much intended. Sex wasn't necessarily illegal, but depending on your class, it could ruin your life. That's where the double standard comes in. A poor man caught propositioning someone of higher class, flogged. A rich man doing the same thing, likely just scolded by a temple priest with a bad comb-over and a discreet wink. Historians still argue whether bathhouses were openly sexual spaces, or whether the erotic stories we have come more from literary exaggeration. But archaeological evidence like graffiti and murals points strongly to the former. You don't paint a giant mural of a man and a satyr unless you expect someone to be paying attention. And it wasn't just Rome. In ancient Greece, symposiums, the famed all-male drinking parties, were another hotspot of class-based intimacy. If you're elite, you recline on cushions, sip wine from a crater, and watch young boys perform poetry music. Or sometimes more. Women were rarely allowed, unless they were hetairae, educated high-end courtesans, who knew how to quote Homer and make you forget your wife's name. Poor men didn't attend symposiums. They worked during those hours. Their entertainment. Maybe a street performer juggling knives for bread crusts. Their sexual encounters rushed rough and rarely indoors. One quirky tidbit: the Greeks believed that the left testicle produced girls and the right produced boys. Some men literally tried to favor one side during sex, depending on what gender child they wanted. That is not how biology works, but hey, points for creativity. Public brothels were another story. Legal, regulated, and heavily classed. Rich men had their favorites, sometimes even setting them up in private homes. Poor men got the curbside version, tiny rooms, basic bedding, and barely a minute to enjoy it. Even among sex workers, status varied wildly. Courtesans could rise to fame, wield influence, and even retire wealthy, street prostitutes disposable. The laws reflected all of this. If you're a poor woman caught selling sex illegally, you might be branded or sold into slavery. But if you're a high-born man exploiting that system, well, the magistrate might raise an eyebrow while adjusting his own toga. And yet across all this marble and muck, a truth emerges even in spaces designed for cleansing the stains of class, never washed away. You reach for a pouch hanging from your belt, fingers brushing the strange, earthy scent of crushed herbs wrapped in linen. If you're rich, you're not taking chances. You've paid a physician well, a bearded man in a toga with a fancy ring to mix imported spices and ground resin from a plant that's more valuable than gold. Because if there's one thing both classes feared equally, it was an unwanted pregnancy. But like everything else, how you avoided one depended entirely on how fat your coin purse was. Contraception in the ancient world was equal parts innovation and superstition. Wealthy women had access to imported ingredients like Silphium, a now extinct plant from Cyrene, that was so prized for its contraceptive properties that it literally got harvested to extinction. If you were elite, you might sip it in wine after sex, or have it ground into a paste and inserted by a trusted servant, yes, a trusted servant. Because nothing says romance like post-coital housekeeping. Poorer women, however, had fewer options and far more uncomfortable methods. They used everything from vinegar-soaked sponges to wool soaked in honey, or even crocodile dung shaped into pessaries in Egypt. And yes, that's real. Ancient papyri describe it, and modern scientists are still debating whether it actually worked or just acted as a really pungent deterrent to intercourse altogether. Historians still argue whether ancient birth control was more effective than we give it credit for, or whether it mostly served a symbolic purpose, a ritual of control over chaos. Either way, you definitely wouldn't want to forget which pouch was for herbs and which one held your fig snacks. Men had their own methods, most of them less than scientific. Some thought that jumping up and down after sex would keep conception at bay. Others swore by wearing amulets carved with obscure spells, sometimes invoking Egyptian gods, to close the gates. And then there was the option of withdrawal, which has been disappointing partners since the dawn of time. One mainstream fact: the ancient Greeks and Romans did understand the basic connection between sex and pregnancy. They just didn't understand the mechanics very well. Aristotle believed that the man's seed provided all the material and the woman simply cooked it, like a uterus-shaped easy-bake oven. If you're wealthy and want to avoid children altogether, there's another darker path: abortion. Recipes from the time mention ingredients like rue pennyroyal and even ground-up bronze filings. You'd hire a midwife or healer, usually discreet, sometimes terrifying. Poor women might turn to street healers or whispered folk recipes, some of which worked, and some of which were lethal. Then there's infanticide, common across classes, but handled very differently. Elite families might quietly send an unwanted baby to be raised by distant relatives, which is often code for a hillside. Poorer families unable to feed more mouths might do the same, but without the polite euphemisms. One quirky tidbit: in ancient China, some wealthy women believed jade inserted into the vagina could balance yin energy and prevent conception. It likely didn't work, but it did give birth to the modern jade egg wellness trend, thanks Goop. The social consequences of contraception were wildly different too. If you're a rich woman and you're caught using contraceptives, you might be scolded for shirking your duty to produce heirs, but forgiven, especially if your husband has heirs elsewhere. If you're a poor woman, though, you might be accused of witchcraft or rebelling against nature, which is a fancy way of saying, how dare you not want to be a factory. It all boiled down to agency. The rich could control their bodies quietly often, through money and connections. The poor, they had to rely on ancient chemistry, desperate prayers, and a whole lot of luck. And while both rich and poor had their own mix of superstitions and strategies, the one universal truth was that sex, no matter how steamy or sweet, always came with stakes. Sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, sometimes delivered in a scroll full of herbs pressed tight under a pillow in the dark. You slip behind the velvet curtain of a noble's private chamber, the heavy fabric muffling footsteps and secrets alike. Inside, the air smells of beeswax musk and something faintly floral, maybe imported rose oil from Damascus. If you're wealthy in medieval Europe, or the Islamic Golden Age, sex isn't just behind closed doors. It's buried under layers of secrecy custom and sometimes disturbingly detailed etiquette. Your bed. It's carved canopied, raised high off the floor to avoid drafts, with a mattress stuffed with goose feathers and dreams of dynastic alliances. But don't be fooled by the softness. Nothing here is casual. Whether you're in love lust or arranged against your will, someone's always watching, or at least listening. In fact, if you're royalty, your wedding night might be witnessed. Yes, witnessed. A bishop, a noblewoman, or an unlucky squire might wait just outside the bedchamber to confirm the deed was done. Sometimes they'd even inspect the sheets, all in the name of lineage, of course. Romance. Meanwhile, poor lovers didn't bother with curtains. They didn't have bedrooms. They had corners. Farmhands might steal moments in the hayloft. Fishermen might sneak into boats and servants. Servants had to get very creative, especially when one loud creak could cost them their position. Or worse, get them married. One mainstream historical fact: by the late Middle Ages, rich households were full of servants who lived in the same rooms as their masters. If you're a noble lady, your handmaiden sleeps on a pallet beside your bed. If you're a knight, your squire's folding your tunic, while your mistress is still putting hers back on. Privacy, it turns out, was a luxury rarely afforded even to the elite, just in a different way. Servants knew everything. Who crept in, who snuck out, who got slapped, who got pregnant, and if they talked scandal. But if they didn't talk, they could be blamed as accomplices. So you learn to balance discretion with survival, like a dancer tiptoeing across a very squeaky floorboard. Historians still argue whether upper-class women had more agency behind the scenes than the records suggest. Diaries, letters, and love poetry hint at quiet rebellion. Carefully managed lovers coded messages in embroidery, and even contraceptive potions brewed with the help of kitchen staff. Poorer women ironically sometimes had more freedom because they had less to lose. A shepherdess who got pregnant might be shamed, sure, but she wouldn't trigger a diplomatic crisis. And in village life, everyone knew everyone else's business anyway. You either married quickly, or you prayed the baby looked like someone vague enough to cause no alarm. And speaking of wild traditions in some rural parts of medieval Germany, there was a courtship ritual where couples were allowed to legally sleep in the same bed before marriage, but with a board placed between them. It was called bundling. Historians still debate whether the board was symbolic or strictly enforced. Either way, you can imagine how often that board mysteriously slid off the bed. Yeah. The materials of intimacy told their own stories. Wealthy lovers exchanged rings, pressed wax seals onto secret letters, or commissioned miniature portraits to wear beneath clothing. Poor lovers. They carved initials into trees, sang each other ballads, or shared a loaf of bread. Bread was romantic when it cost half a day's labor. And then there's the awkward reality of medieval contraception, still largely a gamble. If you're rich, you might have access to imported herbs, or a Greek-trained physician who swears by powdered beaver testicles. If you're poor, it's garlic prayers and timing. Spoiler timing rarely worked. In both cases, when the curtain fell, or the haystack flattened, sex wasn't just about bodies. It was about survival, silence, and what you could safely hide. Because behind every closed curtain, there were ears. Behind every secret, a consequence. And behind every noble bedpost, some poor handmaiden awkwardly trying not to blink. You blink in the torchlight caught mid-breath. Someone's watching. Again. If you're poor, it's the village priest giving you that holy side-eye. If you're rich, it's your brother-in-law pretending not to notice the chambermaid slipping out of your room. Either way, your body is a battleground, and in medieval and early modern society, laws weren't written to protect your privacy. They were written to protect property bloodlines and patriarchal pride. Punishment for sexual misconduct was rarely fair and rarely equal. If you're a peasant girl found in the barn with the neighbor's son, the local magistrate might have you flogged, fined, or forced into a shame marriage. If you're lucky. If you're not. You might be labeled a fallen woman and cast out. But if you're the son of a noble tisk. Youthful indiscretion. Boys will be boys, right? One mainstream fact, many pre-modern European towns had laws specifically regulating who could have sex with whom when, and under what circumstances. Entire church courts were set up to hear cases of fornication, adultery, and unclean thoughts. Yes, thoughts. And yes, people actually confessed them. Voluntarily. So imagine this, you're a poor widow in 16th century England. You're found living with a man you're not married to. Your neighbors report you. You're dragged before a church court, scolded and shamed. Now imagine your landlord, Sir So-and-so, is sleeping with 3 different maids and keeps a French mistress on the side. No consequences. Not even a whisper. Historians still argue whether these church courts truly reflected community morals, or whether they were tools to control the lower classes. Evidence shows that nobles were rarely prosecuted unless their actions caused political fallout. But if you're poor, your love life could land you in stocks on display in the town square, with fornicator chalked on a board around your neck. And don't even think about same-sex relationships. For wealthy men in places like Renaissance Italy, intimate friendships with other men, sometimes openly romantic, could be tolerated if you had enough influence. But if you're poor and caught in a similar situation, the punishment could be exile imprisonment or worse. One fringe tidbit: in some parts of 17th century colonial America, there were actual recorded cases of men being fined for kissing women on the Sabbath even if they were engaged. Apparently, God took weekends very seriously. Even the tools of punishment differed. A noblewoman who broke the rules might be quietly sent to a convent, preferably one with a nice garden. A servant who did the same, whipped, dismissed, and branded with shame that stuck longer than any scar. Sex was also policed through rumors. Rich people had the luxury of privacy and silence. Poor people had walls made of wattle and daub, thin enough for every cough groan or name whispered in the dark to be shared by breakfast. Gossip could destroy you faster than any official decree. And in cities, the divide sharpened further. If you're a poor woman in London, you might be accused of lewd behavior just for walking unaccompanied after dark. Rich women. They had carriages, guards, cloaks with deep hoods, and long stories about visiting their cousins. One of the strangest class-coded punishments. In some towns, adulterers had to wear shame masks. Metal contraptions shaped like animal faces, complete with gags. They were grotesque, humiliating, and of course never required of wealthy patrons caught doing the exact same thing. Even literature got in on the judgment. Plays and poems mocked lusty milkmaids and loose serving girls, while noble affairs were framed as tragic, poetic, even divine. The double standard wasn't subtle. It was practically a genre. So while sex may have been behind closed doors, or at least behind hay bales, it was never truly private. Especially if you didn't own the door, the room, or the land beneath it. Still, people took the risk. A glance in the market, a hand beneath a cloak, a kiss behind the chapel. Because even in a world of laws and lashes, desire found cracks to slip through, even if it sometimes left bruises. You sit at a polished table beneath an ornate ceiling, painted with cherubs that seem to wink knowingly at you. A lute plays softly in the next room. If you're wealthy during the Renaissance, your sexual life is anything but private. It's political, poetic, and at times downright strategic. In the courts of Europe, sex wasn't just a matter of pleasure or scandal. It was diplomacy. The king's mistress could make or break noble appointments. A queen's rumored affair could topple alliances. If you're rich, who you sleep with can change foreign policy. Take King Francois I of France. His favorite mistress, Anne de Pisseleu, had her own apartments, her own staff, and influence over court decisions. She wasn't just eye candy, she was a power player. Meanwhile, the actual queen was expected to stay quiet, bear heirs, and pretend none of it bothered her. Spoiler, it probably did. Poor women, on the other hand, had no such insulation. If you're a servant in a noble house and the Lord wants you, you have two options: agree or leave, often with nowhere to go. Pregnant and alone. That's not a subplot. That's reality. Historians still argue whether some of these relationships were consensual in any modern sense. The power imbalance was enormous. A nobleman might claim to have been captivated by her wit, but more often he was just used to getting what he wanted. One mainstream fact: court mistresses were often educated. They learned poetry, politics, even theology, so they could keep up during pillow talk. They were expected to entertain, seduce, and crucially, not get pregnant, unless it served the royal narrative. Poor women had no such luxury. In cities like Florence and Paris, unmarried mothers faced public fines and were sometimes forced to wear shame badges, literal cloth symbols, pinned to their dresses. There were even workhouses for fallen women, which were less about rehabilitation and more about punishment. But not all love stories ended in tragedy. Sometimes poor couples eloped. They forged their own fates away from rigid systems. These tales rarely made the official records, but they lived in ballads, whispered legends, and local memory. One quirky Renaissance tradition. In Italy, there was a matchmaking practice where a young man would pin a handkerchief to the door of a girl he admired. If it stayed there till morning, she or her parents approved. If it vanished, try again, never. Back in the elite chambers, sex was dressed up in metaphor. Paintings dripped with symbolism: roses, ripe fruit, barely draped figures gazing into mirrors. Love letters between nobles were often encrypted in Latin, with phrases like, "the moon," "Mrs. the Garden," meaning basically, "why aren't you in my bed yet?" Affairs weren't just tolerated, they were expected. Queen Elizabeth I had so many rumors swirling around her court that one ambassador joked no man was safe from her smile. Did she actually take lovers? Historians still debate it, but the point is her image was built around sexual power, whether or not it was exercised. For the poor, sex wasn't symbolic. It was survival. A servant girl might marry a blacksmith not because he made her heart flutter, but because he had steady work and a room with a door. And yet love still bloomed. Because even amid rough linens and exhausting labor, there was room for affection. A shared apple, a whispered promise, a stolen dance at a harvest fair. Sex could elevate or destroy. For the rich, it was a chess piece. For the poor, a coin toss. But in both courts and cottages, people reached for each other, sometimes out of lust, sometimes out of longing, and sometimes just to feel human in a world that often didn't care if they were. And if you happened to be both poor and clever, maybe you made it to court yourself. Maybe you turned a wink into a pension. Or maybe you just found someone to love who didn't care what your bed was made of. You sit on the edge of a factory cot, boots still laced coal dust, still clinging to your fingernails. It's the 19th century now, industrial age England, or maybe bustling Paris, and everything is changing. The machines are louder. The streets are dirtier. The city never sleeps. And neither do your problems. If you're poor, sex is shaped by the same harsh rhythm as your workday: long hours, little privacy, and no room for mistakes. 10 people might share your boarding house, including the couple next door, who clearly doesn't believe in walls. You've got no time for romance. You've got 5 minutes, a shared mattress, and a hope that no one walks in. Meanwhile, if you're rich, sex is all pressed, roses letters, sealed with wax, and carefully arranged encounters between corset and cravat. On the surface, Victorian morality reigns. Everyone talks about chastity, temperance, and the angel of the house. But that's just what's being said. What's being done is another story entirely. One mainstream fact: prostitution exploded during the Industrial Revolution. London alone had an estimated 80,000 sex workers by mid-century, many of them poor women trying to survive. Meanwhile, the upper class both condemned and fueled the trade, visiting brothels in secret, and then passing laws to protect society from immorality. The hypocrisy was stunning. If you're a wealthy gentleman caught with a mistress, you retreat to your countryside estate until things blow over. If you're a poor girl caught selling a single night of her body, you could end up in a reformatory or worse, labeled as fallen for life. Historians still argue whether Victorian society was more sexually repressed or simply more performative. Behind the lace and sermons was an underworld of hidden lives. Secret clubs, locked diaries, red light districts glowing just beyond the gas lamps. One quirky tidbit: some brothels catered exclusively to the bizarre kinks of the wealthy. There were themed houses, including ones styled as ancient Roman villas or faux dungeons. Some even had actors role-playing servants, nuns, or prisoners. Because nothing says upper-class vice like cosplay with a budget. The divide extended into marriage, too. Rich women were expected to be pure before marriage and passive afterward. Their job produce heirs attend dinners and never mention desire. If they had needs, they were directed to novels, heavily censored ones, or in some cases a discreet doctor prescribing hysteria treatments. Yes, that's a real thing. Poor women didn't have doctors. They had back-alley midwives and whispered recipes passed down from grandmothers. Don't stand after, one might say. Drink warm beer and pennyroyal. Risky, unreliable, and sometimes fatal. But when every pregnancy was a potential disaster, you took your chances. Men, too, felt the divide. A working-class man might come home exhausted, share a bed with 3 siblings, and steal 10 minutes behind the pub with a girl from the bakery. A wealthy man had townhouses' courtesans' silk bed sheets, and a valet who discreetly burned the evidence afterward. Even architecture played its part. Rich homes had wings for discretion. Poorer families had one room and an arrangement: if the curtains closed, look away and don't ask questions. One of the strangest moments, the rise of the moral panic around masturbation. Yes, wealthy Victorians genuinely believed it could cause blindness, madness, and even death. Books were written. Devices were invented. Warnings were printed in children's health manuals. Meanwhile, in poorer homes, people didn't have time to panic. They were too busy trying to stay fed. And yet, amid all this hypocrisy and hardship, there was intimacy. Real fumbling human intimacy. Maybe a factory girl fell in love with the butcher's apprentice. Maybe 2 laundresses held hands in secret. Maybe a chimney sweep carved initials into a stone wall no one will ever find. Because even with class control and endless condemnation, desire refused to be regulated. People found ways. They always do. So now, as the lamps dim and the echoes of centuries settle into silence, let yourself drift away from the rules and expectations, the bedchambers and barns, the silks and straw. Strip away the laws and lace, and what's left is something simple. 2 people reaching for warmth in the dark. Across all ages, sex has been shaped by wealth status and power. But it's also been laughter-risk connection, an escape, however brief, from the world outside the door. Maybe tonight, as you lie back under your own soft sheets, you'll think of the lovers who came before, noble and nameless, who snuck past rules, tiptoed past guards, and kissed beneath moons we all still share. The goat, thankfully, is no longer watching. Sweet dreams. Hey guys, tonight we tumble backward into time, into gold-drenched halls, dry desert air, and an empire so vast it swallowed nations whole. We're waking up in ancient Persia, right in the middle of its most glorious and, let's be honest, dangerous moment, the Achaemenid Empire. The morning sun slants through latticework windows, painting geometric patterns across your face. You stretch, and instantly regret it. The air's already hot, dry, and gritty, the kind that makes your nose bleed before breakfast. A servant quietly enters not to greet you, but to spy on you. Or maybe deliver figs. It's unclear. In Persia, everything is a performance, and you newcomer are already several cues behind. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and what time it is where you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You swing your feet onto the mosaic floor. It's cool, polished, and possibly cursed. You're in one of the empire's grander cities, Persepolis, maybe, or Susa, where roofs are supported by columns shaped like roaring bulls, and every wall whispers of Darius Xerxes, or one of the other guys with 3,000-line cuneiform resumes. Being part of this empire sounds glamorous, until you realize you're never alone. Literally. The Achaemenids perfected a web of satraps, governors, informants, and royal guards who knew more about your daily habits than you did. There's a reason they called it the world's first intelligence state. The postman might also be the palace spy. Your barber. Absolutely a snitch. You'd think all this pressure would make mornings efficient. You'd be wrong. The elite start their day with rituals, prayers to Ahura Mazda, ceremonial hand-washing, and perhaps an audience with someone who outranks them, which is basically everyone. Even commoners are expected to greet the day respectfully. No snooze buttons, no pajamas, no cursing the sun. You might get away with mumbling, "Blessed be the fire," if you're quick about it. Historians still argue whether Persian daily routines were genuinely spiritual or simply compulsory pageantry. Were citizens deeply pious, or just trying not to get hauled off by the immortals for disrespecting the holy flame? You'd think the peasants had it easier. No palace stress, right? Wrong. Rural Persians too faced strict expectations. If you were a farmer, you'd rise before sunrise to avoid the heat. Whisper a prayer into the soil and get to work. No sandals. Too bad. The ground's hot enough to grill lamb chops. And if you're a woman, oh boy, your day starts before his. Bread has to be baked, water hauled, children scrubbed, and gossip dispensed at lightning speed before chores. If you're in the noble class, you're draped in embroidered robes and confined to the women's quarters. If you're not, you're out milking goats by sunrise and might still end up married off by dinner time to someone named Bahram, the wheat hoarder. One quirky fact, the Persians were obsessed with cleanliness. And not just take a bath, cleanliness, more like ritual purification, constant grooming, and avoiding anything the Zoroastrians labeled polluted, accidentally touching a dead thing. You'd better have 7 days and a priest handy. Toothbrushes made from aromatic twigs, standard issue. Oh, and those twig brushes, they're actually kind of effective, until a servant mistakes yours for incense and sets it on fire. Even the architecture is judging you. The walls of Persepolis are covered in carved processions, perfect rows of tribute bearers from Egypt, India, Greece. Everyone looks calm, regal, and very well exfoliated. And now, there's you, sweating, panicking, and failing to remember if bowing twice or 3 times is correct. It's 3. Always 3. You wander outside and instantly get sand in your eye. Somewhere in the distance, a priest is chanting. A goat stares at you with unearned superiority. And that's when it hits you. You wouldn't last a day here, not even until lunch. Let's talk outfits. Because in ancient Persia, what you wear doesn't just say who you are, it screams it. Loudly, with layers, and possibly tassels. You stand before a polished bronze mirror, squinting. Is the left sleeve supposed to be longer? Why does your belt have 12 knots? And is this hat actually ceremonial, or did someone prank you? Being well-dressed isn't a luxury here. It's a moral obligation, especially if you're part of the upper class. That means long flowing robes dyed in deep reds or brilliant lapis blues, often woven with intricate patterns that seem to dance when you move, if you can manage to move at all. Achaemenid nobles didn't dress for comfort. They dressed for cosmic order. To appear rumpled was basically a crime against Ahura Mazda. And then there's the beard. If you're a man, your beard is your resume, your philosophy, your entire identity in curly silhouette. It must be oiled, combed, occasionally curled with bronze tongs, and shaped into carefully tiered waves, like a waterfall made of testosterone. Historians still argue whether royal beards were real or enhanced with elaborate extensions. Either way, your chin is doing more work than the rest of your face combined. But you tragically modern and underprepared probably skipped your beard regimen. Or maybe you're a woman, in which case thank the sacred fire. Still, your hair has rules too. Covered, decorated, and perfumed if you're wealthy, knotted, practical, and likely full of twigs if you're poor. Either way, someone's going to judge you. And speaking of poor folks, they don't exactly get a wardrobe budget. Peasant clothing is simple linen, if you're lucky wool, if you're itchy and always dusty. You might get a sash. Probably not. A head covering maybe. But forget color. Only the wealthy can afford the dyes made from crushed beetles, rare flowers, or sea snails someone had to collect by hand, possibly while screaming. One quirky tidbit, shoes. The Persians had surprisingly practical footwear. Soft leather, often ankle-high, with turned-up toes, that helped keep dust and rocks out. They're kind of stylish, honestly. But the elite, they're wearing slippers so delicate you'd cry if someone stepped on them. Which they will, repeatedly. By midday, the sun has risen high, and your many layers feel like they've formed their own atmosphere. But removing any garment in public is out of the question. Even children in noble families are trained early to sit, stand, and walk in proper attire, like miniature ceremonial statues. You're sweating through imported silk, and drawing looks that say, "Are they okay?" Followed immediately by "They're definitely not Persian." And the weirdest part, you can't fix it by asking for help. Language is a whole other trapdoor. Elamite Old Persian. Aramaic, pick the wrong dialect and suddenly your request for a belt sounds like a proposal for war. But let's say by some miracle, you've passed the fashion test. You've tied everything correctly. Your shoes are on the right feet, and your beard is at least beard adjacent. You still have one more hurdle posture. Because in Persia, posture isn't about looking polite, it's political. Standing straight, walking slowly, not pointing your feet at anyone. These are signs that you understand hierarchy. You respect the order of things. You're not a threat. Slouch and someone might assume you're seditious or unclean, or just barbarian adjacent, which is about as bad. Historians still argue whether these cultural codes trickled down through the lower classes or remained mostly within the elite sphere. There's some evidence of social mimicry, peasants imitating noble gestures to gain favor or avoid punishment. You of course try a courtly bow and accidentally pull a muscle, and then, just as you think you've survived your first public outing, a palace servant steps forward with a correction. Your outer robe is inside out. This is not a minor issue. You've just offended Ahura Mazda Darius the Great, and possibly the concept of geometry itself. You're now the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. But hey, at least your shoes looked good while you humiliated yourself. By now, you've managed to dress yourself without igniting a religious crisis, bravo. But that doesn't mean you're ready for what comes next stepping foot inside the royal court. The walls shimmer with golden bricks. Friezes of mythical beasts, griffins, lions, bulls, glare at you from every direction, silently asking whether you belong. Spoiler, you probably don't. You're about to enter a space where every breath is calculated, every gesture rehearsed, and every smile might be followed by a dagger. Persian court life is breathtaking. Literally. You hold your breath half the time because you're surrounded by general satraps, scribes, and eunuchs, all pretending they don't want each other's jobs. Behind their perfectly trimmed beards and stiff ceremonial cloaks, they're locked in a game of divine chess, and you're the pawn that wandered onto the wrong board. You shuffle into the audience hall, or apadana, where the king himself might appear. This is not the place for improv. You walk a precise number of steps, bow at specific angles, and avoid eye contact unless it's invited. A wrong move could be seen as disrespectful or worse, treasonous. And treason here has a rather creative menu of consequences. One mainstream historical fact, Persian kings like Darius I and Xerxes ruled over the largest empire the world had seen, from India to the Mediterranean. To manage this cosmic scale, they maintained an intensely hierarchical court. Everyone had a place. Everyone was being watched. Even the guy polishing your sandals might be reporting your nervous foot-tapping to the king's spy network. Oh yes, spies. The Persians invented one of the earliest known intelligence systems. They were called the king's eyes and ears, and they weren't just a poetic phrase. These were actual agents embedded throughout the empire, including in the palace. Imagine trying to make casual conversation knowing that someone is mentally ranking your every sentence for political danger. You mention missing breakfast, treasonous hunger. You joke about the king's beard symmetry. That's a scrollable offense. Even your silence is risky. One fringe tidbit, court silence, had rules. There were specific situations where staying quiet was respectful, and others where it was wildly inappropriate. Get the timing wrong, and you're suddenly known as that mute foreigner with suspicious morals. But even if you somehow master the rules of verbal landmines, you'll never be prepared for the gifts. Every noble brings tribute to the king, horses, textiles, spices, even trained monkeys. You meanwhile came in with nothing but sweat stains and maybe a stolen fig. Congratulations, you've insulted the empire. Historians still argue whether these gifts were genuine tokens of loyalty or strategic bribes to stay in the monarch's favor. Probably both. But either way, you don't have one, and that means your visit is likely to be short and final. Still, the court has its odd little charms. There are music performances with harps and lyres. Poets who recite praises that somehow rhyme with invincible. Dancers who balance on one toe while juggling flaming bowls. And the food. Don't even think about it. Only the most trusted taste testers get near the king's plate. You try to sneak a grape and nearly get tackled by a eunuch wielding a scroll. And yes, the eunuchs. Their role is far more powerful than you'd expect. They aren't just servants. They're elite bureaucrats, gatekeepers to the king's inner world. Some rise higher than generals. If one offers you advice, take it. If one glares at you, start planning your exit. By the end of your visit, you've bowed too low, insulted 3 satraps, and somehow spilled saffron water on a court musician. A murmur spreads. Your name is being whispered. You are now officially known as that one who looked the king in the eye too long. Time to go. Quietly. Backwards. Without tripping. Try not to breathe too loudly as you exit through those colossal golden doors before someone decides your story would make a really entertaining execution. You're still alive. That alone deserves applause, or at least a stale date from someone's tribute basket. But now it's time to eat. And you're starving, which is unfortunate because dining in ancient Persia is not simply a matter of food. It's a performance, a social statement, and occasionally a gamble with death. The sun dips low over the horizon, casting an amber glow across the palace gardens. You're led to a carpeted dining terrace lined with silver trays, fig-stuffed pastries, skewers of roasted lamb, piles of rice with sour cherries, and bowls of yogurt drizzled with saffron. Sounds amazing, right? It would be if you weren't too terrified to touch anything. You glance around and quickly realize the etiquette is more complicated than a game of chess. Played blindfolded, during a sandstorm. You don't sit unless you're invited. You don't speak unless the food is in your mouth. You definitely don't lick your fingers unless you're already planning to flee the empire. One mainstream fact, Persian elites were some of the earliest to embrace the concept of dining in private. Public eating was frowned upon, especially among the nobility. In fact, according to several sources, kings almost never allowed outsiders to witness their meals. The reasoning, vulnerability. If someone saw how the king chewed it, somehow made him mortal. You, on the other hand, chew loud enough to offend the gods. And here's your next problem poison. The more powerful the host, the more dangerous the dinner. Every cup of wine has already been sampled by 3 different people. Silver dishes are favored not just for their gleam, but because they tarnish when poisoned allegedly. Even the water is suspect. You eye your goblet and wonder whether thirst is worth the risk. Across from you, a satrap dips his bread into a herbed yogurt sauce with such precision, it's like watching a surgeon at work. You try to mimic him but accidentally drop your bread straight into your lap. He glances at you. You laugh nervously. He doesn't. A servant passes by with rose water to wash your hands. You nearly drink it. Another brings perfumed towels. You blow your nose in one. Congratulations. You're now officially known as the one who thought napkins were snacks. Quirky fringe detail. Some banquets involved fake foods carved from wax or clay used in ritual displays before real dishes were served. You take a bite of what looks like a honeyed plum and immediately realize you've just munched on scented wax. Your teeth may never recover. Historians still argue whether these elaborate meals were inclusive cultural events or just performative tools of power. On the one hand, they showcased Persian hospitality. On the other, they were exercises in who could sit closest to the king without dying of nerves. Either way, you don't belong here. You know it. Everyone else knows it. Even the goose roasted in cardamom seems to be judging you. Then there's the wine. Oh, the wine. Sweet-spiced and strong enough to make you see Zoroaster. You're handed a silver goblet, not because you earned it, but because someone thinks it'll be fun to see what happens. You sip, then sip again. Within minutes, you're woozy warm and suddenly convinced you could beat a satrap in an arm wrestling match. You nearly try. Your host starts reciting a verse from Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. Never mind that it hasn't been written yet, and people murmur with appreciation. You try to chime in with a limerick. Silence. Even the musicians stop. One plucks the wrong string in horror. Now someone sneezes, and half the table gasps. In Zoroastrian belief, bodily excretions, including sneezes, were considered impure. Flames had to be protected from such contamination. The brazier beside you flickers. You edge away like it's a judgmental candle. Just when you think things can't get worse, a servant brings over a dish that smells like spoiled roses and feet. You lean in. It's a delicacy, pickled garlic boiled in donkey milk. Apparently it's good for vitality. You nod politely and pretend to eat it by sliding the whole thing under your cushion. Smooth. And then, the king enters. No warning. No announcement. Just robes, rings, and silence. Everyone rises. You rise so fast, you knock over your water splash a scribe and almost dislodge the wax fruit centerpiece. The king glances your way. A muscle in his jaw tightens. Someone coughs. A long, slow moment passes. He turns away. You exhale. Survive dinner, barely. Your stomach churns not from the saffron rice or that donkey milk incident, but from the realization that in ancient Persia, one misstep can swiftly become your last. The good news. You made it through dinner. The bad news, now you have to survive Persian justice. Let's say you accidentally insulted someone important. Maybe you misused their title. Maybe you looked at their horse the wrong way. Or maybe you sneezed in the general direction of a fire temple. Whatever the cause, justice is coming. And it does not come quietly. You're dragged gently but firmly into the central square of the city. It's a spectacle. The crowd gathers, murmurs passing like sand through your fingers. You try to protest, to explain, but your voice is as useful as a paper parasol in a desert storm. Mainstream historical fact: the Achaemenid Persians had an elaborate and famously strict system of laws. The King of Kings, as the emperor was called, stood at the pinnacle of justice. Below him were judges appointed based on merit, at least in theory, and trained in law. In practice, your fate depends less on legal precedent, and more on who's offended, how powerful they are, and whether they skipped breakfast. And here's where it gets worse. Punishments were often theatrical, designed as public deterrents. Think hot sand poured into the mouth for lying, or being trampled by horses, an execution style Darius the Great supposedly favored for traitors. Suddenly, modern traffic courts don't sound so bad. Now you're not exactly sure what you're being accused of. The guards won't say. One just smiles at you with all the warmth of a frozen fig. You try to look innocent, which ironically makes you look guiltier. You're brought before a judge with a beard so long it has its own opinion. He's seated beneath a canopy, embroidered with the Faravahar symbol, the Zoroastrian winged guardian of truth. You're told to kneel. The stones are hot. Your knees burn. Your pride evaporates. He speaks. You don't understand the dialect, but you catch one word: Avesta. That's bad. The Avesta is the sacred Zoroastrian text. If you've offended anything related to that, you're in for it. Then he says, Angra Mainyu. Worse. That's the destructive spirit in Zoroastrianism, the equivalent of being called a devil's intern. Here comes the quirky tidbit. Some Persian punishments involved symbolic cleansing. For minor spiritual offenses, people were sometimes forced to carry dung or walk backward across town, chanting purification verses. But this is no minor slip. A priest steps forward with a vial of bull's urine. Yes, bull's urine, used in ancient Zoroastrian purification rituals. You realize with dawning horror what it's for. You start to run. You don't get far. Guards seize you and carry you to a pit. Yes, a literal pit. At the bottom slither snakes, likely imported for dramatic flair. You dangle over them, flailing like a fish at a philosophy lecture. The judge announces your sentence, time in the pit, to reflect on your impurity. Not death, yet. Just extreme discomfort with optional venom. Here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these kinds of snake pits and theatrical punishments were common practice or exaggerated by foreign chroniclers. Some say the Persians were more just and progressive than their Greek rivals gave them credit for. Others suggest the spectacle was very real, especially in cases involving treason or sacrilege. You dangle. The snakes hiss. One of them seems to smile. Probably just your imagination or a hallucination from the rosewater fumes still clinging to your clothes. And then, mercy. A royal messenger arrives. You're pulled back up, dropped in a heap, and told the king has requested your presence. Again. Maybe he's amused by your survival. Maybe he wants to see if you'll mess up twice. You're beginning to wonder if this is how court jesters get hired. But the lesson is clear in ancient Persia. The line between justice and power is silk thin. Break it, and you don't just fall, you plummet. You stand shaking, knees scraped, dignity shredded, and yet still alive. For now, you might think after the snake pit incident they'd give you a day off, a hot bath, maybe a therapist. Nope. Instead, you're informed without warning or options that you're being sent on a journey. Nothing personal, just a little jaunt along the famed Royal Road. The Royal Road. You've heard of it. Stretching nearly 1,700 miles, it's a masterpiece of Persian engineering designed for speed empire building and postal couriers who must have had calves like marble sculptures. It connects Sardis in the west to Susa in the east, cutting across deserts, mountains, and more bureaucratic checkpoints than a modern airport. And now you're on it. Your mode of transport. Not a chariot, not even a respectable donkey. You're given a creaky cart, 3 camels who hate each other, and a driver who coughs with concerning frequency. You sit sideways, bumping over every rock, reconsidering every decision that's led you here. The cart smells like dried fish and regret. Mainstream historical fact: the Persian postal system, called the Angarium, was one of the most efficient in the ancient world. Couriers were stationed at intervals with fresh horses, ready to carry royal messages at breakneck speed. Herodotus famously said, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness stops these couriers." You're not a courier. So you stop. A lot. The road isn't dangerous in the way you expect. There aren't bandits behind every tree. Instead, it's a constant negotiation with discomfort dust that turns your nostrils into pottery kilns, blistering sun that melts your sandals, and way stations that serve food so dry you could use it as kindling. You drink sour pomegranate wine and eat flatbread so hard it doubles as a weapon. You pass through villages with mud brick houses, bazaars bursting with saffron lapis lazuli and gossip. Locals eye you, guessing your status by your jewelry, your posture, your smell. Children yell something in Old Persian that you suspect is not a compliment. You wave anyway. The camels spit. And then there's the protocol. The Royal Road may be long, but so is the list of things you're not allowed to do on it. You can't outpace a courier, it's punishable by flogging. You can't urinate near fire altars. You must bow when passing a noble convoy. And if the king's litter comes by, you dive into a ditch and wait. Quirky tidbit: some nobles traveled with portable shade tents carried by slaves, elaborate incense braziers to purify the air around them, and even tamed peacocks to walk ahead and ward off misfortune. You, in contrast, are currently being followed by a very persistent goat. But you keep going. You pass stone reliefs carved into cliffs, showing proud warriors, gods with wings, and kings trampling enemies beneath their chariots. It's humbling, also terrifying. You wonder which tourist brochure forgot to mention the hole you may become part of a wall mural risk. The driver sings softly something about love and apricots. You try to sleep, but the camel's rhythmic grunting haunts your dreams. Eventually, your cart jolts to a stop near a checkpoint. Armed guards peer in. They demand to see your writ of passage stamped with a seal from the satrap's office. You hand it over. They squint, frown, whisper. Here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Royal Road was truly open to all citizens, or mostly restricted to royal business. Some evidence suggests limited civilian access, while others propose it was a public utility, just heavily monitored and terrifyingly efficient. The guards finally nod and let you through. One even offers you a fig. Progress. By the time you reach the next city, your back aches. Your tongue feels like sandpaper, and you swear the goat has started following you on purpose. But you made it. Somehow. You cross under a grand archway into the bustling hub of Persepolis, an imperial capital bursting with gold statues and the smell of roasted lamb. Your driver grins. Just a few more days to Susa, he says. You laugh, then cry, then sleep sitting up. One road, endless rules, absolutely no sympathy. You wake to the clang of temple bells and the smell of... Is that burning cow hair, yeah? Yes, it is. Welcome to the religious heart of the empire, where even your morning breath could get you ritually condemned. Zoroastrianism rules the spiritual life of ancient Persia, and it's not just a quiet set of beliefs tucked away in dusty temples. It's the empire's backbone. Everything from court rituals to city planning flows through its core ideas of truth, Asha, versus chaos, Druj. And if you think you can skate by without memorizing at least 3 prayers and 20 taboos, good luck avoiding social death. The moment you step outside, you're already making mistakes. You cough near a sacred flame. A priest narrows his eyes like you've kicked his dog. Fire in Zoroastrianism is not just cozy warmth, it's a pure divine force, a physical embodiment of Ahura Mazda, the one God. Sneezing, spitting, or even breathing too hard near it is basically blasphemy. You try to apologize, but only make it worse by stepping over a shadow cast by the temple wall. A passing elder mutters something about impurity and glares at your sandals. Mainstream historical fact, Zoroastrianism was the state religion of the Achaemenid Empire. Priests known as magi were influential figures overseeing rituals, maintaining sacred fires, and often serving as royal advisors. Temples burned fires constantly tended with elaborate precision. Ritual cleanliness was crucial, not just physically, but spiritually. And that means you're in trouble. You duck into a public bathhouse hoping a quick rinse will reset your cosmic offenses. It's not just for hygiene. It's an act of purification. You strip off your travel-stained clothes and are handed a rough cloth. A stern woman scrubs your back with something that might actually be sandstone. At least the water's warm. Once cleansed, you wander the city and stumble into a sky burial site. There, corpses are left exposed on high platforms, towers of silence, to be picked clean by vultures. It's a strange sight. Quiet. Final. You feel your stomach flip. But here it's the ultimate form of respect, no contamination of fire, earth, or water. Zoroastrians believed corpses were impure carriers of Druj and had to be disposed of without polluting the sacred elements. Quirky tidbit, the bodies were sometimes carried by special corpse bearers who had to live in their own separate communities. They couldn't touch food before washing, couldn't enter homes, and were often banned from public rituals. Think of them as spiritual hazmat workers operating just outside the bounds of respectable society. Trying to blend in, you mimic a few worshippers by performing a short prayer with your hands cupped before your mouth to avoid polluting the air. You murmur something about light and wisdom, but you're just hoping no one asks you to pronounce Gothas. It's like suddenly being asked to sing Gregorian chants in a food court. Later that day, you're invited, or rather pressured, into participating in a seasonal festival. There's music, dancing, and feasting. You're handed a bright sash and told to pray with joy. You try. You do. But then you accidentally drop a morsel of food onto sacred ground and instinctively pick it up and eat it. Silence falls. A small child gasps. A priest faints, probably for dramatic effect. You're escorted out with a tight-lipped warning and a polite threat of spiritual retraining. Historians still argue whether Zoroastrianism was as rigidly enforced in everyday life as royal edicts imply. Some say the strict purity codes were mainly practiced by the upper classes and priests, while others argue that even rural farmers followed ritual calendars and purity laws obsessively. Either way, you are very much not nailing it. By sundown, you're spiritually exhausted. You've bowed the wrong way, sneezed too close to a water jug, and accidentally stepped into a dog's shadow, another no-no, since dogs were considered sacred helpers of the dead. You retreat to a quiet courtyard. In the fading amber light, a priest in training sits beside you and gently explains what you got wrong. He's kind, patient, offers you a dried fig. For once, no one's angry, just disappointed. You take a bite of the fig. It's gritty, like your self-worth. The fire temple behind you flickers. You try not to exhale too loudly. Night falls across the Persian Empire, but rest isn't guaranteed. Not with border tensions, bubbling nomadic raids in the north, and a looming chance you'll be conscripted, especially if you've got even a trace of muscle tone. Or let's be honest, if you've simply walked in a straight line without collapsing. You're jolted awake before dawn. A royal courier gallops past your lodging shouting news of a brewing rebellion near the Empire's far reaches. You hear the distant clang of armor, and for a moment you wonder if it's safer to pretend you're a priest. Unfortunately, your inability to correctly fold a prayer sash has already burned that bridge. Soon you're rounded up with a group of confused-looking men. Some farmers, others merchants, handed a spear that's far too heavy and some leather that might pass for armor. You're going to war, or at least to a staging area that smells strongly of horse sweat and despair. Mainstream historical fact: the Achaemenid Empire maintained one of the largest and most diverse armies of the ancient world. Soldiers were drawn from all corners of the empire. Babylonians, Medes, Egyptians, even Indian war elephants. You're not just fighting with Persians. You're trying to coordinate with someone shouting military orders in a dialect that sounds like angry coughing. The army camp is a logistical wonder and a total sensory nightmare. Food is boiled meat. You're expected to sleep under the stars in full armor next to a camel that hates you specifically. There's a guy from Sogdiana who won't stop sharpening his knife while staring at you, and someone else keeps trying to trade you healing mushrooms in exchange for your boots. And let's not even get started on the latrines. At dawn, you march. Or more like shuffle. Your sandals have already failed you. The famed Royal Road, that great marvel of Persian engineering, is smoother than most paths, yes, but that doesn't help when you're being marched along it in triple-digit heat, with a pack that smells like wet goat. Quirky tidbit: elite cavalry units were sometimes accompanied by small choirs or musicians to boost morale. You pass one such unit, and the music is beautiful flutes and drums, but all it does is highlight how miserable you are. Someone's toe just fell off. It wasn't even bleeding, just plopped. Word arrives that you won't be heading into battle after all. You've been reassigned to bribe duty. Yes, that's a thing. Rather than endless warfare, the Persian Empire often used wealth to neutralize enemies. A little gold here, a few princesses in arranged marriages there, problem solved. You're handed a pouch of coins and told to smile more as you approach a border chieftain. No pressure. Historians still argue whether the Persian military dominance was due more to its sheer size or to this flexible diplomacy. Some claim the empire maintained peace for decades through soft power, while others argue its reputation for terrifying punishment kept everyone in line. You suspect it's both, plus elephants. Always the elephants. Speaking of which, yes, there they are. Awar elephants. Giant musky-tusked beasts draped in bronze and silk. You try not to panic, but one of them looks you dead in the eyes, lets out a growl that sounds like a bassoon in a bad mood, and begins walking directly toward you. You faint. Not dramatically, just a quiet, resigned flop onto the dusty ground. When you wake, you're back in the city, miraculously spared any wounds. The coins are gone. Your shoes are gone, and someone's braided your hair into something that may or may not be sacred. The war went fine. The bribe worked. The empire still stands. But you're done. You limp toward the edge of the city, hoping no one needs another diplomat warrior or religious convert. The moon hangs low and golden. The Zoroastrian fire temple glows in the distance like a lighthouse made of judgment. You survive one day in ancient Persia, barely, and only because someone else fought your battle, prayed your prayers, and fed your camel. But hey, that fig was decent. Now slow your breathing. You're back in the present. There are no snakes in the courtroom. No one will drag you off for a ritual sneeze. The heat has faded, the dust settled. Picture the glow of a fire temple far away, gentle, steady, untouched by wind. The noise of war has passed, and the night is still. Let your limbs unclench your mind. Soften. You've wandered an empire and lived to tell the tale. Not perfectly, but enough. And in this moment, that's all you need. Sleep curious, traveler. Tomorrow brings new empires to explore. Sweet dreams. Hey guys, tonight we're waking up in a medieval roadside inn, probably on a lumpy straw mattress that smells suspiciously like damp goat. A distant rooster is screaming at the pre-dawn dark, and your back is already aching. Outside, the world is still foggy, the cobbled courtyard, slick with dew, and your cart creaks like it too has regrets. You're a traveling merchant, and this isn't a vacation. It's business. Tough, grimy, relentless business. You probably won't survive this, at least not with all your teeth and dignity intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far we travel together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your fingers are numb as you pull your woolen tunic over your head. It's itchy. Everything is itchy. The innkeeper is already banging on doors, shouting about unpaid tabs, and threatening to water down breakfast porridge if people don't get moving. You check your cart. It's still there, mostly intact. Your cargo today: dyed cloth, salt, a few iron tools, and if you're lucky, a jar of foreign spices that smells like wealth. You count the sacks again, not because you forgot, but because the rats might have remembered. The morning routine is painfully methodical. You mutter a quick prayer to St. Nicholas, patron of merchants, while rubbing a small wooden token for luck. There's no toothbrush, but you chew on mint leaves and hope that's enough to keep your breath from offending a noble, or worse, a moneylender. Your boots are stiff with mud from the last town, if you can even call that puddle collection a town. One buckle is broken, and you patch it up with a twist of leather cord, whispering threats to your own footwear, like it's a wayward mule. You check your ledger, a scrap-bound notebook that you guard more fiercely than your own life. Yesterday's profits were meager. You sold a single bolt of crimson wool, but only after 3 rounds of haggling and a promise you didn't intend to keep about pure Venetian dye. Historians still argue whether most merchants genuinely understood the value of their own goods or simply survived by sounding confident and adding a mysterious from the east to everything. Breakfast is gray. A mush of barley, maybe oats, definitely mystery. You eat it anyway because calories mean survival. The inn's dog sits beside you watching every bite with judgmental eyes. No one trusts a silent dog. One of the other travelers, a tinker with too many pots and not enough manners, tries to start conversation. You grunt. Merchants, while technically a class, are not a united brotherhood. Every man or woman on the road is either competition, a threat, or a walking liability. You load your cart with shaking arms. The wooden wheels groan like tortured ghosts. You've named one of them Betrayer because it's come off twice in a single week. The donkey, bless its heart, farts and ignores your presence entirely. You mutter a few unkind things to it too. It's all part of the routine. As the sky turns from violet to pale gold, you scan the horizon. The road today winds through open fields and low forests, a mix of potential robbery and wagon-eating puddles. A small dirty boy offers to sell you protective herbs. You give him a copper and pretend to believe him. Superstition's cheaper than protection. You've got a mile to go before the first real challenge, crossing a toll bridge manned by someone with too much authority and not enough teeth. But we'll get to that. Right now, you slap the reins. Let out a long, suffering sigh and begin your day on the road, hoping the weather stays mild, the wheels stay on, and your bowels don't act up again. You are a merchant, yes, but mostly you're just a survivor with a cart full of dreams and mud on your boots. You haven't made it half a mile before trouble starts nibbling at your heels. The road out of town is a bumpy mess of churned mud and frozen ruts carved by too many hooves and too few civic projects. You're not just leaving the village, you're escaping its taxes, its gossip, and its questionable porridge. But first the gate. The guard at the town's edge doesn't look up from his dice game. He already knows you're going to stop. Everyone does. It's not a law exactly, it's more of a ritual. The bribe dance. You pull the reins and try to smile, which probably looks more like a grimace thanks to your one swollen cheek from last night's surprise apple pit. Inspection fee, the guard says, holding out a hand as if he's blessing you. You sigh and offer 2 coppers. He frowns. You add a third. He nods, barely glancing at your cart. Historians still argue whether these small-time tolls were officially sanctioned or just creative entrepreneurship by hungry guards. Either way, you're down 3 coins and 1 layer of patience. As you creak forward, your donkey steps in a puddle, the depth of your shin. Water sloshes into your boot. Lovely. The bridge looms ahead, an ancient wooden thing arched over a lazy stream. The planks creak, and so do you. A second tollman appears, this one older and somehow angrier. He insists on a wheel tax. You stare at him. He stares back. Eventually you cough up a silver, if only to avoid standing here all day while your bread grows moldy. And then, of course, there's the cat. It darts out from beneath the bridge just as your cart crosses black as night and silent as betrayal. Your donkey snorts. You spit over your left shoulder and mutter something in bad Latin. Superstition may be laughable in the daylight, but on the road, you don't take chances. Besides, last time you ignored a black cat, your axle broke. Coincidence? Sure. Maybe. The morning mist starts to lift as you leave the bridge behind. Fields open up around you, dotted with crooked trees and silent scarecrows who seem just a bit too lifelike from certain angles. You munch on a stale heel of bread and wonder not for the first time why you didn't become a monk, or a chimney sweep, or literally anything that doesn't involve arguing with rodents over food storage. The day moves slowly. A pilgrim passes you going the opposite way, muttering prayers and smelling strongly of onions. You nod politely. Travelers are part of the landscape, some friendly, some not. You keep your hand close to the dagger tied under your cloak, just in case. Bandit attacks are more common than village festivals, and you've heard whispers of a group working this route. They don't take everything just what they like. One merchant claimed they stole only the good wine and left his wife behind. Make of that what you will, he'd muttered darkly. Your donkey slows down near a roadside shrine. You sigh and stop. People believe ignoring a shrine brings bad luck, and you're not keen to push your luck any further today. You light a candle, murmur a rushed prayer to Saint Christopher, and toss in a dried fig as an offering. It's probably a terrible snack for a saint, but it's all you've got. Lunch is boiled turnips and regret. You chew without tasting eyes, scanning the road ahead. It bends toward a small forest, and you know what that means. Shade silence and potential arrows from the trees. The donkey seems unconcerned. You envy that. A pair of fellow merchants catch up 2 brothers selling miracle ointment made from beeswax and divinely blessed mud. You've seen their jars. It's definitely just mud. But they're charming, which is half the battle. They gossip about a town down south where merchants were fined for offensive wares, though no one could define what that meant. Historians still argue whether these fines were genuine attempts at regulation or just creative extortion by board officials. As the sun climbs higher, sweat begins to soak your underarms and your cloak starts to stick. You take it off only to get a wasp up your sleeve. The resulting dance would terrify peasants and delight children. By the time the trees begin to thin and a town roof peeks over the next rise, you've endured bribery, superstition, soupless meals, and unsolicited gossip. But hey, you're still alive, mostly dry, and the cart hasn't lost a wheel yet. That in merchant terms is what we call a raging success. You haven't taken 10 steps into the forest before it all starts to go wrong. The road narrows, the light dims, and your donkey, who's somehow smarter than you, starts to hesitate. You nudge it forward, but there's something about the way those trees close in like gossiping monks at a cloister door that makes the hairs on your neck do that annoying stand-up thing. The forest is a known shortcut, but it's also known for less desirable company. Bandits love a good thicket easier to disappear after they lighten your load. You keep your dagger close and your eyes scanning the underbrush. A squirrel darts across your path and makes your heart leap clean out of your chest. You clutch your chest and mutter a curse loud enough for the squirrel and hopefully any human ears lurking nearby. Historians still argue whether traveling merchants faced banditry as often as the chronicles suggest, or whether it was exaggerated to justify higher caravan taxes. Either way, it feels like they're watching you. And that's enough. You make it through the woods without incident. But you're not celebrating just yet. The road opens into a swampy patch of land where the wheels sink, the donkey protests, and every mosquito in the kingdom seems to have chosen you as their personal buffet. You slap grumble and consider whether it's too late to become a mason. By mid-morning, you stop at a roadside way station, a glorified bench under a half-collapsed roof, supposedly maintained by the local guild. There's a jug of water, a sad-looking loaf of communal bread, and some graffiti carved into the beam above "God save merchants, no one else will." Truer words were never carved with a dull knife. Lunch-boiled turnips. Again. You've been eating so many you're starting to suspect you might be turning into one. You try to liven it up with a pinch of salt from your pouch, except oops. That pouch also holds pepper cinnamon, and something that may or may not be powdered tree bark. The resulting blend tastes like regret and mystery. Still, you press on. The sun climbs your back, aches, and your donkey develops a limp that might just be an excuse to slow down. You pass a procession of pilgrims dragging a wooden effigy and singing off-key. You nod respectfully. They ignore you. Typical. Your path eventually crosses with 2 mounted nobles out on a hunt. That's in air quotes, because their hunting party includes a dozen servants, a portable tent, and one guy whose job seems to be holding grapes. They glance at your cart, your donkey, your entire existence, and then move on. You wonder if you've just been judged by someone named Baldwin III. You continue over a low ridge where the path turns rocky. The air grows thick with dust, and your donkey decides that now, right now, is the perfect time to take a nap. You argue plead, and eventually bribe it with a dried apricot. It grudgingly agrees to continue. You're not sure who owns who anymore. Then come the clouds. Thick, grumbling ones the color of bad pewter. You start mumbling prayers you barely remember, promising Saint whoever you are that you'll attend Mass every holy day if he could just not let your cart wash into a ditch today. The rain starts anyway. Just a sprinkle. Then more. Then the full biblical flood treatment. Your cloak saddle and everything not wrapped in waxed linen are soaked. You try to keep the wool dry. That wool is your moneymaker this season. If it smells too much like wet sheep, you'll be laughed out of the next market. As the rain pounds down, you spot something ahead, a covered stone archway marking the outskirts of a town. A miracle, or at least shelter, and maybe a stall to sell your wares. You lurch toward it like a pilgrim crawling to a holy relic, the cart dragging through the muck like a stubborn ox. Inside the town, you're immediately swallowed by the noise bells, clanging people shouting, chickens fleeing from carts. The fair's already in full swing. Great. That means the best spots are taken, the drunkest customers are already broke, and you'll probably have to sell next to a juggler with a goat. Still, you've arrived. Alive, muddy, slightly beet-colored from your boiled diet. And yet you made it. This is where the real work begins. The marketplace is chaos, distilled into sound and smell. You edge your cart forward into the square, dodging a minstrel twirling flaming torches and a fishmonger screaming about oysters fresh from the Thames. Swear on me, sainted mother. Your boots squelch through something suspiciously soft, and you don't look down. Better not to know. You scan for an empty stall like a hawk watching for prey, or in this case, a corner of dirt not already claimed by a tanner baker or morally flexible fortune teller. One space looks open, but a burly woman with forearms like a siege engine plants a broom there and glares at you. Message received. Eventually, you claim a wonky table wedged between a barrel organ and a cellar of genuine relics. He tries to sell you a toe bone from St. Ethelbert. You decline partly because you're not convinced St. Ethelbert had 12 toes, and partly because it's clearly just a chicken knuckle. You start unloading your goods, woolens, bolts of rough cloth, a few metal trinkets, and a half-crushed crate of dried plums. A boy offers to help for a farthing. You agree. He pockets the coin and vanishes. Classic. Setting up shop is an art. You drape the fabrics just right, fluff the apples, and strategically place the decent-looking turnips on top of the bruised ones. Merchants nearby are already heckling the crowd. Best linen in Essex cheaper than sin. You try your own call. Cloth that won't make you itch much. Not your best line, but your voice cracks halfway through anyway. A woman laughs. You pretend you were joking. Soon the customers come trickling in. A monk eyes your wool and asks for a discount for the glory of God. You offer him a discount for the glory of me not starving. He frowns, mutters something about purgatory, and leaves. A local noble's steward buys 3 yards of cloth pays in coin, so old it might have belonged to Charlemagne, and asks if you'd be willing to throw in a bolt of ribbon for the lady. You throw it in. The noble's wife is likely terrifying, and you'd rather not anger her by proxy. By midday it's hot crowded, and someone's decided now is the perfect time to parade a dancing bear through the square. The bear looks as tired of its job as you are. You both exchange a long, understanding look. Lunch is more boiled turnips. You eye the pies a baker's boy is hawking nearby, but remember what happened the last time you risked meat of unknown origin. That fever lasted 2 days, and you hallucinated that your donkey could talk. He was surprisingly critical of your business choices. A bard begins strumming a lute nearby, singing a ballad so long and boring that even the fleas start evacuating. You count your earnings under the table: 4 silver pennies, 3 groats, and a shiny button. Someone slipped into your hand instead of change. You consider chasing them down, but let it go. You'll probably use it to bribe a child tomorrow. As the day wanes, the crowd shifts. The early risers are gone, and now it's the heavy drinkers, the hagglers, and the ones who want to just look for 30 minutes before buying nothing. One man tries to trade you a live goose for your entire cart of apples. You counter with 5 apples for 1 cooked goose. He storms off. The goose seems offended too. Historians still argue whether medieval fairs were strictly regulated or delightfully lawless. Judging by the 2 jugglers now fighting over who owns the performance corner, you'd guess it's a solid delightfully lawless. A town guard ambles over, tells them both to shut it, and then asks you for a stall tax. You hand over a coin. He winks, pockets it, and ambles away whistling. Evening brings in a fresh wave of bartering, mostly folks drunk enough to pay double or haggle backwards. A woman offers you a charm to keep the Black Death away. It's a dried frog in a pouch. You buy it not because you believe in it, but because you're too polite to say no. You pack up slowly. Your back cracks. Your feet ache. You've made a little profit, avoided being trampled by a cow, barely, and only got rained on once. All in all, a success. And just as you're loading the last of your cloth, a kid sprints past, grabs a bunch, and vanishes into the crowd. You sigh, look at the donkey, and say aloud, "I miss turnips." You leave the chaos of the market with slightly lighter packs and significantly heavier feet. The sun dips low, its red-orange glow leaking across the sky like spilt wine. You'd admire the view if your back didn't feel like someone had hammered it for fun. Still, you've got miles to cover before sleep. The road out of town is dust and hoofprints, edged with wild hedges and the occasional carved milestone. You guide your donkey, who's clearly more enthusiastic about the end of the day than you are, toward the next village. You could stay the night in town, of course, but the local inn is known for beds full of fleas and a barkeep who waters down everything, including the candles. Instead, you opt for the open road, the fresh air, and the distinct possibility of being mugged. Freedom. You pass a group of pilgrims trudging in the opposite direction. They carry badges from Canterbury and look like they haven't smiled since Christmas. One offers you a walnut in exchange for directions. You have no idea where they're going, but you point vaguely southeast. They thank you, as if you'd parted the Red Sea. The next stretch is forested, cooler, quieter, and much more ominous. You tug your cloak closer. Bandits are a reality, but so are wolves, boars, and very aggressive geese. You keep your staff close. It's not much, but it makes you feel braver. You name it Reginald, in a moment of fatigue-induced whimsy. A rustle in the underbrush makes you jump. It's just a fox, dashing off with something furry in its jaws. Still, you walk a little faster. You remind yourself that most travelers survive these roads. Most. Historians still argue whether medieval roads were maintained by royal edict, or simply neglected until they became goat paths. Judging by the crater-sized pothole you nearly disappear into, you suspect the goat theory has merit. Eventually, you reach a small hamlet, more a clump of buildings with ideas above their station. A few houses, a church with a listing bell tower, and a tavern that looks like it's one loud sneeze away from collapse. You decide it's home for the night. The tavern's interior is aromatic, a mix of ale smoke, old onions, and possibly goat. You pay a coin for a bed, really just a wooden shelf stuffed with straw and judgment, and a bowl of stew that is 80% turnip, 15% mystery, and 5% hopeful optimism. You sit by the hearth, nursing a wooden mug of ale. It tastes like damp bread and regret. Still, it's warm. Other travelers share the fire. A wiry man claims he once outran a tax collector on foot. A woman in a tattered cloak sells amulets blessed by St. Hubert's own ghost. A child plays with a wooden top and sings a song about cheese and death. You don't ask. A friar plops beside you and starts talking theology with the intensity of a man who's definitely had 6 ales and thinks Aristotle was overrated. You nod politely, pretending to understand. He shifts mid-rant to complaining about fleas. Apparently, his robe is infested with spiritual suffering. Eventually, you beg off and head to your bed in the loft. There's a goat already on it. You debate your options. You sleep on the floor. The goat looks smug. The night air is thick with snores, creaks, and the distant howl of something that probably doesn't want to cuddle. You wrap your cloak tighter and do your best to relax. The straw pokes you in places that definitely didn't need poking, and the floor is somehow colder than the outside. Still, your body starts to unwind. Your legs ache, your arms are sore, and your mind spins with the day's chaos. But you've survived barely. You made a few coins. You didn't eat anything obviously poisonous, and you only got swindled once. You wonder if the next town will be better. Maybe fewer dancing bears, maybe more honest monks, maybe fewer goats in beds. Just as you drift towards sleep, the goat farts. You stare at the rafters and whisper, "I hate turnips." You wake up stiff cold and strangely damp. The goat is gone. Praise be, but it left behind an aromatic gift that convinces you to never ever sleep indoors again. You stretch with a series of pops and groans worthy of a medieval symphony and gather your things. Your pack feels heavier this morning, probably from the damp air or the existential weight of being a traveling merchant. Your first task, find somewhere to wash the goat funk off. A nearby stream serves well enough. You splash water onto your face and arms, pretending it's refreshing rather than ice-cold torture. A boy herding geese watches you the whole time, like you're the strangest thing he's seen all week. You give him a wink. He throws a pebble. Fair enough. Now comes the real challenge, finding tonight's shelter. Because in your line of work, lodging is a dice game, and last night you rolled a 1. You hit the road early, hoping to reach the next town before sunset. The weather has other plans. Clouds gather like gossiping nobles, And soon the rain begins, not a gentle drizzle, but a biblical deluge. Mud swallows your boots with every step, and your donkey looks like it's seriously reconsidering its contract. The roads become rivers, cartwheels sink cloaks become soggy blankets, and you're pretty sure something just swam past your ankle. You press on fueled by the hope of a fire and dry socks. But let's be honest, dry socks are a medieval myth. By mid-afternoon, you reach a crossroads where a local farmer points you toward the next settlement. A village so small, it doesn't even have a name, just a sign that says "and that way." You trudge into town, soaked, starving, and smelling like a compost heap. The inn here is technically open, but the innkeeper eyes you like you're a walking sack of plague. You try a smile. He tries charging you triple. You both compromise when your donkey sneezes in his face. You're given a cot in the corner of the common room, no private rooms, unless you're a noble or worse, a musician. The common room is loud, hot, and full of damp travelers, comparing whose boots are wetter. One man claims he saw a leech with teeth. Another says his cart was struck by lightning, which sounds fake. But who's checking? You strike up a conversation with a fellow merchant from Bruges. He trades wool, but today he's mostly trading complaints. You bond over your mutual hatred of potholes, bandits, and turnips. He tells you about a town where the mayor insists all merchants wear matching green hats. You silently add extra hat to your packing list. Historians still argue whether medieval inns genuinely functioned as safe havens, or if they were just legalized trap houses for desperate travelers. Based on the smell, you suspect the latter. That night, you find yourself sharing your cot with 2 sacks of barley and a cat who refuses to move. You don't have the energy to argue. You curl around the barley and pretend the cat isn't judging your life choices. There's a lull in the room's noise, just the soft murmur of snores and the occasional drunken giggle from someone recounting a bad barter. You stare at the ceiling where cobwebs stretch like medieval drapery. Somewhere downstairs, a lute plinks a sad, out-of-tune melody that sounds suspiciously like your bones feel. As you finally begin to drift off, a massive sneeze shakes the room. Someone curses. A baby starts crying. And the cat stretches luxuriously, pushing your face deeper into the barley sack. This is life on the road. Sometimes you get a feather bed and warm ale. Sometimes you get barley and bronchitis. But hey, at least it wasn't the goat again. Dawn doesn't so much arrive as it barges in uninvited. A rooster shrieks somewhere. A baby is still crying, and your back feels like it's been personally cursed by a minor saint with a grudge. You sit up slowly, barley grains clinging to your cheek, and the innkeeper tosses you a look that says, "Your welcome has officially expired." Breakfast is a crust of bread, questionably gray cheese, and something the innkeeper insists is meat. You don't ask questions. The cat glares at you as you eat it, which probably says more than you want to know. Today's leg of the journey is mercifully short, but there's a hiccup. It's Sunday. And in this particular patch of the Holy Roman Empire that means no trade, no work, and absolutely no cursing, gambling, or unapproved dancing. You're welcome to attend Mass, though, and frankly, you'd better. You sigh dust off your less muddy tunic and head toward the stone church in the center of the village. It's small, squat, and smells like incense and damp sheep. Inside, the air is thick with solemn chants and side eyes from the locals who immediately clock you as not from around here. One little girl points at your foreign shoes and whispers something to her mother. You try not to trip walking to the pew. You kneel and cross yourself, eyes flicking to the priest. He launches into a sermon that sounds half scripture, half passive-aggressive commentary about the state of outsiders and their suspicious morals. You nod along politely and try not to look too suspicious. This is not the time to talk about that merchant in Marseille selling relics made from chicken bones. The tension of the service is only broken by the old man behind you snoring audibly halfway through the Nicene Creed. You envy his confidence. Outside, the villagers gather in the square for conversation and slightly holier gossip. A woman selling honey cakes offers you one on credit. A monk gives you a side eye as you chew it. You consider reciting the Lord's Prayer just to be safe. The local priest approaches, robes billowing expression unreadable. You brace for some kind of religious quiz. Instead, he asks what wares you carry. You mention pepper and wool. His eyes light up. Apparently, his cousin in Mainz has been searching for decent wool for weeks. You nod carefully. You do not want to end up in some theological debate over fair pricing. Medieval merchants walked a razor's edge with the church. Profit was frowned upon. Usury outright damnable. Historians still argue whether traveling merchants were genuinely pious, or simply skilled at playing pious long enough to avoid trouble. You're leaning toward the second. You spend the rest of the day pretending not to notice you're being watched. You're fairly certain that if you quote prices aloud, someone's going to accuse you of heresy, or at least bad math. So you bide your time, mend a strap on your bag, and help a boy chase a runaway chicken in what you believe counts as a good deed. At sunset, bells toll. You kneel again as villagers cross themselves, and you do the same, though you're not entirely sure which direction is east anymore. The priest gives you a brief nod of approval, and you take that as a small win. You're still alive. You're not excommunicated. You even got a free honey cake. That's practically a miracle. Later, tucked into the corner of a different inn, one with only moderate goat aroma, you reflect on the day. Navigating medieval faith isn't just about avoiding damnation. It's about understanding that belief and business often walked hand in hand, sometimes uneasily, sometimes out of sheer survival instinct. You say a silent prayer before bed, not just to God, but maybe also to the donkey gods, hoping your cart makes it through another week. The cat from before. It's here too. You don't ask how. You wake before dawn, again. You're always waking before dawn. Somewhere between sleep and aching knees, you realize your pillow was actually a sack of lentils. You stretch, groan, and pat your coat to make sure your coin purse is still there. It is barely. Lighter than you hoped, heavier than it could have been. That's the traveling merchant's eternal state. Not rich, not poor, but always one bad wheel away from disaster. You sit by the dying embers of the inn's hearth, squinting at your ledger. It's a mess of scribbles shorthand, and the occasional angry doodle of a tax collector. You tally your takings. 6 bolts of wool gone. 3 pounds of pepper sold twice what you paid in Venice. The salt didn't move, and the beeswax candles, one was stolen by a goat. You sigh, make a note. Train goat awareness. Coins clink softly in your hand. Some silver, some debased copper. A few foreign coins you'll need to smuggle past a border warden or two. There's also a Byzantine nomisma tucked away. You keep it for luck, even though scholars still argue whether those were really circulating this far west during your time. It feels like history in your palm. It also feels suspiciously like something someone might stab you over. You take stock of your pack. Crates lighter boots, heavier with road grime. Your tunic smells like a tragic stew of old onions and horse. But hey, you're alive. No one called you a heretic yesterday and your horse didn't die. All wins. The next leg of your route sprawls north toward a town with a name you can't pronounce, but remember by smell: smoked herring and boiled cabbage. You've heard they have a magistrate who actually enforces weights and measures. That'll be fun. You chat briefly with another merchant over morning beer, yes beer, because water is an excellent delivery system for dysentery. He's heading west, says there's a boom in glass beads there. He also warns of thieves near the crossroads and mimes a throat-slitting gesture while grinning. You politely laugh and promptly add 2 extra hours of walking to your route to avoid those roads entirely. As you load up the cart, your donkey looks at you with the same expression as every donkey in history: existential disappointment. You promise it apples when you reach the next market. You both know you're lying. You take one last look at the village behind you. It wasn't the worst. You didn't get cheated, accused of witchcraft, or forced to marry someone's cousin in exchange for barn space. That's a solid 8 out of 10 medieval score. But the road always calls, or at least the slowly rotting cheese in your pack demands you get moving before it becomes sentient. The wind picks up as you trudge down the muddy path. Ahead is another town, another tax, another awkward dinner with garlic and no utensils. But there might also be a kind innkeeper, a deal on dried figs, or a barmaid who sings songs in Provençal that you almost recognize. And so you go on. Because while you wouldn't call this a comfortable life, it is a life. You've got stories, scars, and just enough coin to make tomorrow slightly more tolerable than today. You've learned how to smile through aching feet, how to lie convincingly about the origin of your silk, and how to pray without making enemies. And tonight, you'll count your coins again. You'll calculate what can be bartered for what, and you'll dream maybe of a warm bed, a dry roof, and a year where you don't have to chase someone who ran off with your apples. For now, you keep walking. Now the fire crackles low and steady. The wind's edge softens into a whisper, and your journey begins to blur into the gentle hush of twilight. The rattle of coins, the sway of a loaded cart, the distant bells of a faraway church all drift quietly into stillness. You've walked the dusty roads of medieval Europe, bargained, prayed, laughed, and survived more than most could in 100 lifetimes. And as the stars blink awake over narrow timber towns and flickering lanterns, you ease back, exhale slow, and let the weight of the world slip away for now. Sweet dreams.